This was a message I received after a game versus Indy. You suck, ugly ass N-word.
There is a machine running inside the WNBA media ecosystem, and that machine has one purpose. Take any negative online interaction involving a black player, point it directly at Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever fanbase, and flood the timeline before anyone has time to ask a single verifying question. That machine fired up again this week, and Chelsea Gray was the one standing at the controls. The claim was explosive, the framing was deliberate, and the moment the internet started actually looking at who sent the message, the entire story began collapsing in real time. This is Rim Run, and today we are pulling apart the most cynical narrative play of this WNBA season, piece by piece, receipt by receipt, until every single layer of the manufactured outrage is gone, and all that is left is the uncomfortable truth.
I still believe the threat narrative is a way to try to get people off said athletes or whoever's back.
Let me set the table for every single person watching this video, because the facts of this story matter enormously, and they have been almost entirely buried under the emotional noise. Chelsea Gray, the Las Vegas Aces guard, posted a screenshot of a direct message she received following a Sunday night loss to the Indiana Fever. The message was vile. It used a racial slur. Nobody on this channel is going to defend the person who sent it, and nobody is going to pretend that kind of message is acceptable. That is not what this video is about. That is not the conversation we are refusing to have. The conversation we are refusing to skip is the one about what Chelsea Gray did next. Because she did not just post the screenshot, she framed it. She attached a narrative to it. She pointed the accusation, implicitly and deliberately, at Indiana Fever fans and at the Caitlin Clark fanbase. And she was not alone. Alyssa Thomas had already done the same thing before this incident. The pattern was already established. Post the slur, gesture toward the Fever, let the internet do the rest. And the internet did exactly that. Within hours, the outrage machine was running at full capacity. Caitlin Clark's name was trending. Fever fans were being called racists en masse. The story was everywhere. The framing was everywhere. And almost nobody stopped to ask the one question that changes everything. Who actually sent that message? Sit with that question for a second, because the answer is the entire story.
This was a message I received after a game versus Indy. You suck, ugly ass N-word.
Here is what the internet found when people actually started looking. The account that sent Chelsea Gray that message was not an Indiana Fever fan account. It was not a Caitlin Clark fan account. It was a sports betting account. The person behind it was identified as a sports gambler, reportedly a fan of a team based in Texas, who had apparently lost money on a bet involving the Aces game. He had only followed 2 WNBA players total before deactivating his account. 2. Not a fanatic, not a Fever superfan, not someone who had spent months in the Caitlin Clark supporter ecosystem. A gambler who lost a parlay and typed something disgusting into a message box. Let me say that again so it lands properly. The person who sent Chelsea Gray a racist message following the Las Vegas Aces loss to the Indiana Fever was, by all available evidence, an Aces fan who was furious that his bet on the Aces did not pay out. He was not mad at Chelsea Gray because she plays against Caitlin Clark. He was mad at Chelsea Gray because she did not help him win money. That is the actual story. That is the thing that got swallowed whole by the outrage cycle before it ever had a chance to surface. And here is the part that should make every honest person watching this video genuinely uncomfortable. If that gambler had bet on the Fever instead of the Aces, he would have won money that night. The Fever won. The people who bet on Indiana walked away up. There is no universe in which an Indiana Fever fan, celebrating a victory, sits down and fires off an angry racist message at a player on the losing team. The math does not work. The psychology does not work. The framing does not work. But the framing got amplified anyway. Because the framing was useful. Now I want you to hear exactly how this narrative was constructed. Because the language Chelsea Gray used when she posted that screenshot was not accidental. Don't take my word for it. Here is the exact framing she put on that post, in her own words.
I still believe the threat narrative is a way to try to get people off said athletes or whoever's back.
She said it, with the post time-stamped right after a game versus Indy. This was a message I received after a game versus Indy. That is the framing, after a game versus Indy. Not after I lost a bet was left in the message. Not from a sports gambling account. After a game versus Indy. The geographic and competitive anchor is Indiana. The implied sender is an Indiana-adjacent person. The implied motive is the rivalry with Caitlin Clark and the Fever. That is the entire architecture of the accusation built into one sentence, and it was built deliberately. There is no spin to put on that. The framing was the message. The framing was the weapon. Now I want to escalate this conversation, because this is not an isolated incident, and treating it like one is exactly what the people running this narrative want you to do. This is a pattern. It is a documented, repeatable, mechanical pattern that has been deployed multiple times during this specific WNBA season. And it always follows the same 4 steps. Step 1. A black WNBA player receives a negative online message, often using a slur. Step 2. The player posts the message publicly, with framing that connects it to the Caitlin Clark and Indiana Fever ecosystem. Step 3. The outrage machine amplifies the framing without verifying the source. Step 4. By the time the actual sender is identified and the framing collapses, the damage is already done, the narrative has already circulated, and Caitlin Clark's name has already been attached to racism she had absolutely nothing to do with. Alyssa Thomas went through this same cycle before Chelsea Gray. The pattern was already established, the playbook was already written, and the WNBA media infrastructure, the people whose job it is to report on this league accurately, let it run both times without asking the basic verification question that any first-year journalism student would ask. Who actually sent this? Let me be entirely clear about something. The existence of racist messages on the internet is not surprising, it is not shocking, it is not news. There are hundreds of millions of people on social media platforms, and a meaningful fraction of them are anonymous accounts with no accountability and no filter. NBA players receive racist messages. NFL players receive racist messages. Soccer players in Europe receive racist messages. This is a brutal, undeniable reality of what it means to be a public figure with a large social media presence in the current era. It is disgusting, it is real, and it is not specific to the WNBA. It is not specific to the Caitlin Clark moment, and it is not evidence of a coordinated racist campaign by any particular fan base. But here is the thing. When NBA players get racist messages, they do not post them with framing that points to a specific rival team's fan base as the implied source. They do not construct a narrative that turns a random troll's anonymous garbage into an indictment of another franchise's supporters. They absorb it, they condemn it, or they ignore it. What they do not do is weaponize it. And the reason the WNBA outrage cycle around these incidents is so much louder, so much more sustained, and so much more damaging to innocent people is precisely because the weaponization is part of the strategy. And who pays the price for that strategy? Caitlin Clark pays the price. Every Indiana Fever fan who has never sent a racist message in their life pays the price. Every person who shows up to a WNBA game wearing a Fever jersey and gets looked at sideways because of a narrative that was built on a lie pays the price. That is not justice. That is not accountability. That is collateral damage from a manufactured story. And the people manufacturing it know exactly what they are doing. I want to talk about the enabler structure here, because the individual players are not the only ones responsible for how this narrative spreads. The WNBA media apparatus, the reporters, the commentators, the social media accounts with verified checkmarks that amplified Chelsea Gray's post without a single caveat, without a single "we have not verified the source of this message," without a single "we do not know who this account belongs to." They are complicit in the damage this story caused. This is the conversation that television refuses to have. When a story fits the preferred narrative, verification becomes optional. When the framing serves the right purpose, basic journalistic standards get suspended. And the people who suffer for that suspension are not the players who posted the screenshots. They already have their viral moment. They already have the sympathy wave. They already have the solidarity posts from teammates and league officials. The people who suffer are the ones who got falsely accused by implication. The ones who got their fan base branded as racist based on evidence that turned out to point in the exact opposite direction. The old guard of WNBA media has been running this playbook for the entire Caitlin Clark era. Every controversy, every physical altercation, every social media incident gets filtered through the same lens. How does this connect to Caitlin Clark? And how does connecting it to Caitlin Clark serve the narrative that her fan base is uniquely toxic? And the answer they keep arriving at, regardless of the actual evidence, is always the same. It always connects, it always serves the narrative. Even when the evidence says it was a sports gambler from Texas who lost a parlay. Let me be direct about the cost of this pattern to the league itself. The WNBA is in the middle of the most commercially significant moment in its history. Caitlin Clark's arrival has brought in audiences, sponsors, television ratings, and mainstream cultural attention that the league has never experienced at this scale. That is an opportunity. It is an enormous, potentially transformative opportunity for every player in the league, for every franchise, for every coach, for every person whose livelihood depends on the WNBA's growth. And every single time a story like this one gets amplified without verification, every time a false framing gets attached to the Fever fan base, every time Caitlin Clark's name gets dragged into a controversy she had nothing to do with, that opportunity gets smaller. The casual fan who was just starting to pay attention looks at the toxicity of the discourse and decides it is not worth engaging with. The sponsor who was considering a partnership looks at the controversy cycle and decides the risk is too high. The growth stalls. And the players who were supposed to benefit from that growth are the ones left holding the bag. That is the real cost of manufactured outrage. It is not abstract. It is not philosophical. It is dollars and eyeballs and opportunities that evaporate because the people running the narrative decided that a short-term tactical win was worth more than the long-term health of the league they claim to represent. Now I want to address the secondary layer of this story, because there is a second tactic that gets deployed after the initial outrage wave, and it is just as calculated as the first one. Once the source of the message gets identified and the framing starts to collapse, the narrative pivots. It stops being about the specific message and starts being about threats. The claim shifts from, "I received a racist message," to, "I am now receiving threats because I spoke out about the racist message." And suddenly the story has a second life. Suddenly the person who posted the screenshot is not just a victim of one anonymous troll. She is now a victim of a coordinated harassment campaign by the people who were upset that she exposed the troll. I want you to hear exactly how this escalation tactic gets described, because it is the most revealing moment in this entire story. Here is the framing on the threat narrative, verbatim. There it is. The threat narrative is a way to try to get people off said athletes' backs. Let that sink in for a second. Because what that describes is not a genuine safety concern. What that describes is a tactical deployment of the threat claim as a shield. Say there are threats, and suddenly the conversation about whether the original framing was accurate becomes off-limits. Say there are threats, and suddenly anyone who questions the narrative is accused of enabling harassment. Say there are threats, and the story gets a second news cycle, a second wave of solidarity posts, a second round of amplification, all without anyone ever having to go back and answer the original question: why did you frame a message from a sports gambling account as evidence of Indiana Fever fan racism? That is not accountability. That is not transparency. That is a two-stage narrative weapon, and it has been used repeatedly, and it keeps working, because the media infrastructure that is supposed to interrogate it keeps choosing amplification over verification. And here is what makes this particular deployment of the tactic so revealing. The person who sent the original message was identified. He was not an Indiana Fever fan. He only followed 2 WNBA players before deactivating his account. He was a sports gambler who had apparently bet on the Aces and lost. That information was publicly available. It was circulating on social media at the same time the threat narrative was being amplified, and the outlets and accounts that had been loudest in amplifying the original framing were almost entirely silent about the correction. Almost entirely silent about the fact that the person they had implicitly connected to the Caitlin Clark fan base turned out to have no connection to the Caitlin Clark fan base whatsoever. That silence is the story. That silence is the most damning thing in this entire episode, because it tells you everything you need to know about what the outrage cycle is actually for. It is not for accountability. It is not for truth. It is for the moment of impact. The correction is not useful. The correction does not serve the narrative. So the correction gets buried, and the original framing stays in circulation. And the next time someone mentions Chelsea Gray and Caitlin Clark in the same sentence, the association is already there, already poisoned, already doing its work. Let me now render a verdict on every single layer of this story. Because there are multiple parties involved, and each one deserves a clear, direct assessment of what they did and what the consequences of their choices are going to be. Chelsea Gray made a decision. She received a disgusting message from what turned out to be a sports gambling account. And instead of posting it with neutral framing, or not posting it at all, she chose to anchor it to a game against Indiana. That was a choice. It was a deliberate choice. And the consequence of that choice is that an entire fan base got falsely implicated in racism they did not commit. That consequence does not disappear because the original message was real and vile. The message being real does not make the framing accurate. The framing was the problem. The framing was the weapon, and Chelsea Gray fired it. The WNBA media apparatus made a choice. They had the tools, the access, and the professional obligation to ask one basic question before amplifying that framing. Who actually sent this message? They chose not to ask. They chose amplification. They chose the narrative. And the consequence of that choice is that the league's most commercially important moment is being corroded by a toxicity cycle that they are actively feeding. That consequence belongs to them. The social media mob made a choice. The accounts that went after Fever fans, that called Caitlin Clark supporters racists en masse, that turned a single anonymous troll's message into an indictment of an entire community. They made a choice to convict without evidence. And the consequence of that choice is that they are now on record having falsely accused thousands of people based on framing that turned out to be demonstrably wrong. That is not activism. That is not justice. That is a mob. And mobs do not become righteous just because the cause they think they are serving is legitimate. And Caitlin Clark, who had absolutely nothing to do with any of this, who was not consulted, not involved, not even playing when the message was sent, who has spent her entire rookie season being used as a lightning rod for controversies she did not create, Caitlin Clark is still standing, still playing, still breaking attendance records and television ratings and every commercial metric the league has, still doing the thing that the old guard of WNBA media desperately wishes would stop mattering, which is making the league impossible to ignore. She is still here. She is still running. And every single attempt to attach her name to manufactured outrage has failed to slow her down by a single step. The establishment tried to make this story about Caitlin Clark's fans being racist. The evidence said it was a sports gambler who lost a bet. The establishment tried to make the correction disappear. The internet found it anyway. The establishment tried to pivot to threats to get the story a second life. The pattern was already documented. None of it worked. None of it has ever worked. And the reason it has never worked is because the truth is not complicated in this case. The truth is actually very simple. A random troll on the internet sent a disgusting message. That troll was not connected to the Indiana Fever or to Caitlin Clark in any meaningful way. The framing that connected him to that ecosystem was false. The outrage that followed was manufactured. And the people who manufactured it knew what they were doing from the moment they hit post. That is the story. That is the whole story. And every single person in the WNBA media infrastructure who amplified the false framing and then went silent when the correction came out needs to look at what they did and ask themselves whether the short-term tactical win was worth the long-term damage to a league that desperately needs honest coverage right now. The answer, for anyone paying attention, is obviously no. But they are going to do it again. They are going to do it again because it works long enough to matter, because the correction always comes too late to undo the damage, and because the machine that runs this cycle has no incentive to stop running it, until the audience stops rewarding the framing. Until the casual viewer starts asking the verification question before they share the outrage post. Until the people who actually love this league and want to see it grow start holding the narrative machine accountable for the damage it is doing. That is where the power actually is. Not in the viral post. Not in the outrage wave. In the audience that refuses to be manipulated. In the fan who reads the framing and asks, but who actually sent it? Ask that question every single time. Every single time. Because the answer is the story. And the story is almost never what the framing says it is. Here is your forced choice for the comments section today. And I want a real answer, not a safe one. Do you believe Chelsea Gray knew the framing she was putting on that post was misleading? Or do you believe she genuinely assumed the message came from an Indiana Fever fan without checking? Those are the only two options. Either she knew and she posted it anyway, which makes this a deliberate narrative play. Or she did not know, which means she accused an entire fan base of racism based on an assumption she never verified, which is its own kind of recklessness. There is no third option where this framing was accidental and also responsible. Pick one and put it in the comments below. If this video gave you something the mainstream coverage did not, hit the like button. It is the single most important thing you can do to help this channel reach the people who are still only getting the manufactured version of this story. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you are here the next time the machine fires up and we need to pull it apart before the damage is done. This is Rimrun. We will see you on the next one.